Thanks, John. There's obviously lots to discuss, so let's get to our panel. Joining me from Tucson, Arizona is Tim Lennon. He's a sex abuse survivor and the president of the SNAP Survivors Network of those abused by priests. With us from Boston is Ray Flynn. He's a former U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. He's also a former mayor of Boston. Also joining us from Berlin is Matthias Katsch. He too was sexually abused and is now an advocate for victims of child sexual abuse by members of the Catholic Church clergy. And from Boston, we're joined by Donna Ducette. She's executive director of a group called The Voice of the Faithful. Welcome all of you to the show. Ray, I want to start with you in Boston because the Catholic Church under Pope Francis has moved in a direction to create reforms, to try and reach out. Talk of zero tolerance. Are they doing enough? And are they doing it quickly enough?
Well, as the Pope himself said, they certainly can do a heck of a lot more, that is the Catholic Church. I think one of the issues that we're still struggling with is the initial statement by Pope Francis when he said about homosexual priests and the sex abuse, who am I to judge? And people still remember that and they carry that message. And that's unfortunate because even the Catholic Church is making great progress in identifying sexually abusive priests and exposing them and bringing them to the proper law enforcement officials, which they should do. People still remember those initial words by Pope Francis, and that's the challenge that the Catholic Church has to get over. Who are we to judge of the Pope? You judge people on the basis of whether or not they protect innocent young minors. In the case here in Boston initially in 2002, they didn't.
Tim Lennon, we spoke to you about a year ago about this crisis and the efforts to redress these horrible historical wrongs. Do you think in the last year that we have seen progress from Pope Francis? We had this meeting back in February. There's new legislation talked about when it comes to behavior within the Vatican and Vatican emissaries around the world. Is this enough?
No, I don't think that the Pope has done anything, basically. I mean, he's given condemnations, he's given apologies, he's talked about penance, he's talked about forgiveness, but no action is taken. And until we see actual bishops and cardinals removed, like Cardinal Pell, this pedophile who...
Yes, carry on.
Seriously, yeah, Cardinal Pell seriously abused young children. It stops me in my track because I know the tragedy of child sex abuse. And the Pope still hasn't removed him. He's still a cardinal, he's still a bishop, he's still a prince of the church. Cardinal Berivan, who was convicted of covering up sexual abuse, he offered his resignation. The Pope declined to do that. So we can see that the Pope has not taken action. He can give us more thoughts and prayers, but until he starts to do something, we're going to continue this process. For instance, in Italy, the Council of Bishops in Italy, it's still up to the bishops whether to report to civil society or not. The Pope could tell every bishop in the world, report every accusation of sexual abuse to civil society. The Pope hasn't done that.
Thank you. Matthias, you're in Europe, a little bit west of where the Pope is this week. Are you hoping that he addresses this while he's here? He's talked about migrants and other things, but nothing so far on the abuse scandal. And as we just heard, the scandal is global, but also, as you well know, unfortunately, in Europe as well.
As you said, it's global. It's in all countries where the Catholic Church is present. You have heard reports of abuse by priests, by clergy, to children and young people and vulnerable adults. I think they try to get over it. And they think that they have done a lot. They are convinced themselves that they had acted. But from the point of view of the survivors, nothing has changed. Nothing has happened. We are still waiting for truth, for opening the files, the archives, for investigation, for inquiries in many countries. We are still waiting for compensation, for help, and we are still waiting for the famous zero tolerance, which is still a slogan and not a universal law of the church. So much talk, and they try to get over it. They hope that the attention of the general public is shifting to other issues, and they don't have to really come to action. That's why survivors all over the world are organizing themselves and trying to put the pressure on the Vatican, put the pressure on the Pope, that finally they are doing steps forwards.
Let's go from Berlin to Boston again now. Donna Ducette, you are part of a real grassroots organization out of Massachusetts. We saw a lot of reporting early on in this crisis from Boston, the Boston Globe. Where do you see things going now, and where do they need to be going?
They need to be going farther into the area of accountability. As each of these gentlemen has mentioned, there is a lot of talk. There has been a lot of talk for more than a decade. There was a lot of talk in previous decades, but little action. There are increasing actions in the United States, at least, because many of the bishops who before had not revealed lists of those who had been credibly accused of abuse are now publishing those lists. Those lists are incomplete. Mr. Lennon, as a member of SNAP, knows that almost immediately after the publication of any list of abuser priests, there will be a report from SNAP and a report from Bishop Accountability that they have missed some. Is that because some of the records are missing? No doubt. Is it because some of the records have been destroyed? No doubt. Is it because some of the records were hidden and even the current inhabitants of a chancery don't know they exist? Sure. But the bottom line here is that you've got to open all the files. You have to hold all of the bishops accountable. A pedophile is under terrible control by his own sexual devils, if you will, if you want to call it that, although I think the devil made me do it excuse is just that, an excuse. But if you look at the pedophiles, you see that they are suffering from illness. The bishops don't have that excuse. They know right from wrong. They are not in the throes of some sort of sexual evil. They know right from wrong. They chose to protect the church at the expense of children. And how do you change that? You have to look at the systemic problems inherent in the structure of basically a feudal structure adopted from the old Roman Empire that isn't making it into the 20th or the 21st century in a way that benefits the people of the church. How do you make that change? Well, certainly you need direction from the top, because the bishops won't listen to anybody except who's at the top. But you also need it from the grassroots, because lasting change in any organization, but especially in a centuries-old organization like the church, which believes in what we call the communion of saints, which is all of the Catholics, past, present, and future. That's where you need to make the change so it percolates up.
Ray, also in Boston, Donna's point there about essentially U.S. states and U.S. jurisdictions doing what the Vatican won't do. We've seen it in Massachusetts, increasingly in New York with 120 there, Georgia, the latest as well. Is this unique in terms of the U.S., or you see this spreading around the world? And what exactly can jurisdictions do that perhaps the Vatican is not doing?
Well, I think I agree with what Don just had to say. Transparency, I've been in politics a long time. Oftentimes the embarrassment of the program is the cover-up. It's not the actual offense. And if I had my way, the church would have been more transparent right at the outset in releasing this information and exposing it, deal with it, and get it over with, and make the necessary reforms and changes. They're doing that in some regard, like New York did the other day with 115 priests and deacons, but it's a slow pace. It's done begrudgingly, reluctantly, and it gives the appearance that the church is not real serious about being out front, which I think that they ought to be out front. That's why I've always said that there should be some lay people dealing with this issue, lay Catholics or lay people who have a real concern. Let them get involved so it's not just done in-house, but open it up for outsiders.
I'd like to
Go ahead.
jump in on this point. I'd like to jump in on this point because we saw after the exposure of the Boston Globe and the Spotlight series that the church was compelled to do something. And as a result, the following year we had the Dallas Charter. Recently, in August, we had the Pennsylvania grand jury that exposed widespread sexual abuse, systematic, historic. And we can see that what happened in Pennsylvania happens in every parish in the United States. And what's happened because of that community outrage, because of the advocacy of organizations like SNAP, the church has been compelled to release these names. They're not releasing these names because of any kind of moral compass or any moral authority of the church. It's because the public is forcing them to do it. And what it shows is that they could have released these names a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And how many other children suffered because they kept these names and these predators and these persons hidden. So they're compelled to release these names. And even when they release names, we find that there's little semblance to truth. For instance, in Buffalo, Bishop Malone in April said that there were 42 predators. Now we know that there's 120, maybe 150. So even when they release names, they are not fully truthful. Some of them don't include nuns or don't include those that were abusing adults. So we have to keep in mind that the church is only doing things when it's compelled to, like the Dallas Charter or like this recent release of lists by about 70 dioceses.
Interesting you talk about the church only acting when it's compelled to. Also, there is a debate within the church, isn't there, about how to react to this. I want to play just a clip of Pope Francis and his talk about zero tolerance, then I'll get Matthias's reaction off the bat.
The Church will spare no effort to do all that is necessary to bring to justice whosoever has committed such crimes. The Church will never seek to hush up or not take seriously any case.
Now, Matthias in Berlin, that was the Pope there, but a previous Pope, of course, Pope Benedict, has also been weighing in, seeming to try and explain away a lot of the crisis on the sexual revolution, the acceptance of paedophilia in society. Reading his remarks was quite incredible, considering where the Catholic Church is right now. What's going on behind the scenes? Are we seeing a battle between conservatives and the progressives in the Catholic Church?
For sure. There is a power struggle within the Church, within the Vatican as well, but also in the local churches in many countries between more conservatives and more liberal bishops. But let me stress this point. Zero tolerance is only a slogan. For the last 30 years, we have heard this from 3 popes, from 3 different perspectives. But the universal law of the Church is still the same, and it's not in there. The sexual revolution, if you want to call this liberation of the 60s, has helped, I think, that in our days we are able to talk about sex in a different way and also talk about abuse in a different way. So it's right, the opposite of the analysis of Benedict. But I think change is only happening when there is pressure from outside. We can't wait until the Church is solving their internal debate. They are debating since the 60s about celibacy, about the women's role in church and other reform issues. If we wait until they come to conclusions, survivors don't have the time to wait for this. We need to put the pressure from outside the church to really help open the files, compensate people, and make changes which are significant as the zero tolerance policy to make it really come true in the church law. This is what we have to do, and we can't wait until they come up with a solution from inside the church.
But before going to Donna, I just wanted to raise a reaction to what Pope Benedict said. I mean, you're a former ambassador to the Vatican. How do you see this standoff, if you like, between Pope Benedict and Pope Francis and the different influences within the Catholic Church in terms of this crisis?
You know, we're living in a society, and I'm sure you all understand that, and most of the people watching this would understand it. We're dealing with really extremes on all levels. I like your question about, is it a conflict between conservatives and progressives or liberals? Yeah, that's what's happening in our country. We see it all the time in politics. You just listen to William Barr the other day, and Democrats on one side say one thing and Republicans on the other side say something entirely different. And the mainstream people, the public, interested in good government, are looking at this down the middle, and they're thoroughly confused. Well, that's what's happening in everything. There's so much confusion. That's why I think transparency, openness, there's a lot of good people who love the Catholic Church, who want to see reform, but they also want to see justice and make sure that the Catholic Church deals with this issue of pedophile priests and eliminates them from the church, and the victims are compensated and dealt with fairly and justly. We don't have that kind of mainstream movement in America that specifically does that. Yes, we have good groups on the left and we have groups on the right, but they don't, you know, it doesn't make the train move down the line on the tracks. And that's the biggest challenge we have in America today.
Donna, in terms of this sort of split within the Catholic Church, how does that play out at the base level for you and the congregation groups that you know one of yours represents? How does that play out in terms of frustration about the pace of all this?
It plays out, I think you chose a good word, frustration. Working at the grassroots, we work with, we develop relations with people who might be considered conservative, who might be considered progressive. We see that among the priests we work with, but the goal is to move forward within the church to make the systemic reforms that are necessary so that the church can move into and speak to members of the church in the 21st century and speak to the global church. It's unfortunate when any extremist group co-opts all of the language and then attempts to apply their solution, which might be the extreme solution, to what we all recognize as a common problem. And as Mr. Flynn said, transparency, accountability, if you put it all out in the open, then you can deal with it, and we can make those choices. We need to trust the people to make the choices. But I'm reminded of a quote that Sister Joan Chittister, I'm quoting her at one of our conferences. She said, you know, you've got those old fogies sitting in the corner saying, oh, it used to be so much better before, we've got to do it, we've got to change this, you can't do that, you can't do this. She said, just let them sit in the corner. The change is happening. They can't stop it. You're going to see vestiges of the old, let's go back to the past, gain ascendance in certain areas, but just ignore them. Keep making the change. The church has to move forward.
Thank you. Matthias, talking about moving forward, what's next? Because a lot of observers of this and a lot of victims thought perhaps Pope Francis' visit to Chile and his really sort of turnaround in terms of that country's crisis with abuse victims and priests may have had an effect. Now we're seeing news coming out of his native Argentina. A lot of people are saying, go to Argentina, your home country, address this head on, get ahead of it. Is that kind of the next test for this Pope in terms of this crisis?
We need to put pressure. Yeah, we need to put pressure on the church. And that's why we organize survivors from more than 20 countries came together in February in Rome. And there is a delegation from the US at the moment, for example, in Argentina, supporting local survivor groups in Argentina, which are demanding the Pope to come to his home country to confront the issues there. There are a lot of stories where he personally was involved, being Archbishop Cardinal of Buenos Aires, which needs to be clarified. So this is the path. We need to put pressure from the survivors groups, but we need also the support from the civil society. The church itself cannot solve the problem. The solution is not inside. As we have heard from Benedict, it is not us, it has been the influence of the 60s, and for Francis it's the influence of the devil. No, it's about their responsibility and accountability, and we need to make this very clear. So we are ongoing organizing survivors from all over the world, and we count on the support of the civil societies to have this pressure on the church. This is the only way they will really make changes.
I want to go to Tim in a second, but before that, I'm glad you mentioned the pressure, because remember back in February, we had a lot of pressure. We had that global twilight vigil for justice in Rome. There was a lot of attention on that. I want to play you a clip of a Belgian woman whose family member committed suicide in the wake of their abuse. And Tim, I just want to get your reaction off the bat.
The measures that the Pope must take are give the names of sexual predators all over the world. Make them public, because there are still too many who are hidden, still alive, sometimes even in parishes or near children, and who continue to abuse. It has to stop now.
Tim, I'm going to give you the last word, because that, sort of brings it home, doesn't it? That the suffering still continues. People do take their own lives. What needs to be done to get this over with? I mean, we've talked about foot dragging in this whole show. What's it going to take for this crisis to pass and the Catholic Church to turn over a new leaf?
Well, I think Matthias said it correctly, and that is civil society needs to take action, to stand up. Prosecutors and politicians need to do their job to protect the community. We've seen over and over that the church continues to hide, cover up, and as long as they continue to do that, children and those that are vulnerable are threatened. So that's why we've called for state investigations in every state in the United States. 19 states have done so far. We're going to be pushing the rest of the states to initiate investigations like we've seen in Pennsylvania and Illinois, because we know what happened in Illinois and what we saw in Pennsylvania with hundreds and hundreds of priests, thousands of victims. This happens in every parish. So we're going to rely on civil society to do its job to protect our community, and not rely on the church, because as long as they cover up, my belief is no community is safe.
Well, Tim and Toussaint, thanks so much for sharing. Obviously, still a very painful wound at the heart of the Catholic Church. Also, obviously, want to thanks Ray in Boston, also Donna in Boston, as well as Matthias, also from joining us from Berlin. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks so much for joining us.